He is a leading historian on Carolingian history and has recently written a book, Making and Unmaking of the Carolingians, 751 to 888. Please welcome Stuart Airlie. And as always, as we're going to discuss Charlemagne today, and it's very much part of Carolingian history. So, how did you get into Carolingian history in the first place?
It's a familiar story, I suppose, of having a very charismatic teacher. As a boy, as a schoolboy, I was probably a bit of a geeky schoolboy and was interested in history. I'm very interested in the Romans for some reason. And so I thought the Middle Ages looked quite dull because it was all shaggy barbarians destroying things. And then got to university and
That's, I think, is
very
most people's perception of medieval history.
yes, yes, yes. And of course, it annoys me now. And I think, no, not like the Romans who were horrible. The Middle Ages is actually much nicer than the Roman Empire. But I was taught, among my, it was a man called Patrick Wormold, who was a wonderful, charismatic teacher. And it was all new to me. So I didn't know about Europe after Rome. So I not only got this new world of Merovingians in Gaul with their long hair and the Visigoths in Spain, but got the idea that there were new ways of looking at the past. This was the 1970s, and people in Britain were really just rediscovering Europe after Rome, the early Middle Ages. So it was not only new to me, the nice thing was that our whole class felt we were at the beginning of a new kind of history, and I've just never stopped, I suppose.
And of course, let's start with Charlemagne's father, Peppin the Short. And how is he? Where did he come from? And was he from dynasty already, or did he establish a new dynasty? Where did he come from, Peppin?
Pippin is exactly as you say. He is the creator of a new dynasty. He's from a very complicated world of conflict in the Frankish kingdom, what we'd call France, roughly France, some of modern Germany, some of the Low Countries. And he is a member of a great aristocratic family. And in some ways, I always suggest to students the thing to think about is maybe the Godfather movies here, of these different clans fighting for power with a language of honor and family. And Pippin is from a family that is trying to dominate the kingdom as the older kings, the famous long-haired kings, the Merovingian dynasty, seems to be losing power. But there's no reason for the Merovingians to have stopped. Pippin, it's not that they fade away. Carolingian propaganda would like people to think that these kings were fading away and the Carolingians had to take over. No, the Carolingians launch a takeover for their own purposes. And I think Pippin's main enemies are his own family, in fact. And that's what drives him, I think, in his bid for power.
As is the most case in royal feuds, in it.
Yes, it is. It is. He has to jump at that time because he's got various brothers who could challenge him. None of them are kings. They all obey the old dynasty, but the old dynasty really has lost power to the aristocracy. So there's a lot of feuding. It is a kind of Game of Thrones situation. Who should be entitled to rule, and how do you persuade people that you're the right person to rule? And so Pippin needs to make a bid for power in 751. Otherwise, his nephew will become old enough to challenge him, and one of his brothers is on the prowl seeking to regain an inheritance. So I think we shouldn't think of the dynasty as a unified family, but as full of quarrelsome members, each of whom thinks they've got a claim. And Pippin, in order to keep himself secure, makes a bid for the throne and has this ritual coronation in 751 and gets rid of the old dynasty, sends them off to a monastic imprisonment, and proclaims himself, his wife, and their children as the new royal family.
So he is a usurper, in other words?
He is. But they mustn't say that, because again, it's like Game of Thrones. If you do this, then some other aristocrat with a mighty sword and a lot of followers will think, well, why can't I do it? So you don't want people to think that anybody can do it. So he needs to have a ritual. He needs to have a ritual coronation, blessing, and an aura of royalty even as he's challenging a king, he must immediately make himself look like a ruler whom God wants to rule, to try and stop other people trying to take over.
So how does he do that? How does he arrange the ceremony to make it legit that he isn't really usurper, as he said?
That's a good question. How does he do it? And there's, I suppose, two answers to that question. One is a very dull and detailed academic answer about the fact that our evidence for his coronation is very problematic. The other answer, I think, is a quicker answer, to say that he gets the support of most of the warriors, and he gets the blessing of churchmen. He might have been anointed with holy oil, the sort of thing that we're going to be seeing in Britain very soon with the coronation of King Charles III, who will be properly crowned next year, we think, rather than this year. So ritual of some sort, some ceremony to mark Pippin and his family. It's really important that he had young children and a wife, because it's about saying this is the new royal line. And so the blessing of the church, possibly anointing, as well as the consent of the warriors in a holy place, a great monastery somewhere in Francia, probably in Soissons, to try and mark himself off as special. It's about trying to look unique, trying to look special, and willed by God.
So how does this relation with the Lombards? Because they aren't Frankish, right? They're different kind of race or a clan at the time. I'm not sure about race is the right word, but they're different clan and empire in a sense. So how does it go against them, or does he how is the relations with the Lombards here?
The relationship with the Lombards is very complicated. They are indeed a different people, a different one of the barbarian groups who rule the West. At this time, Western Europe is ruled by warrior elites, whether they're in the British Isles, the Anglo-Saxons, or Irish kings, or in Italy, or in Francia. And in Italy, it is indeed, as you say, the Lombards. Franks and Lombards are rivals. They're very close. They share the same culture. Pippin, as a young man, is sent by his father to be brought up at the court of the Lombard king. And so he grows up at the Lombard king's court when he's a teenager, when he gets the ritual of shaving his beard for the first time. And it's the great warlord of the Lombards shaves his beard at a ceremony that probably goes back to ancient Rome, where Roman youths dedicated their shaved beard to the gods, I think. And so there's close family bonds and close bonds of marriage alliance with the Lombards, but there's also political rivalry. The Franks, if they're going to expand south of the Alps, they're going to hit the Lombards. If the Lombards are going to expand north of the Alps, they're going to hit the Franks. And there's the role of the popes as well, who are players in Italy. And the Lombards are a formidable grouping. So relationships with the Lombards are an important angle. And I think they must have been a wee bit unnerved to see a new dynasty emerge among the Franks. But it's quite far away from the Lombard centres of power. I don't think they were very worried, though later on, of course, things do change.
Of course, that changes with Charlemagne and later, yeah. Which we,
Absolutely.
of course, that's what this episode about, and we're going to come back to him. And of course, and I wanted to talk, but first I want to talk about the Stuart, because I was reading Johannes Freyd's book recently on Charlemagne, and he claims that nobody really knows anything about Charlemagne's youth. So how come it is not written down if he was the child of a king who's big the new dynasty? You would think that people would write down, and if he became later this great founder of an empire that lasted for 1,000 years. So how come we don't know much about his youth here?
Yep. I think one answer is we know very little about anybody in this period, that the early medieval period, the period before the year 1000, doesn't give us a lot of personal detail about any individuals. And that when Charlemagne was a child, of course, people didn't know he was going to become Charlemagne. We know some things. We know, although Johannes Freyd says we can't believe it, how he lost his first tooth while playing around in a graveyard in a church ceremony, and he cuts his tooth against one of the gravestones. We do know that he's very young when he is sent out to meet the Pope. When the Pope visits Francia in the year 754, Charlemagne is about 6, and he's sent by his father on horseback to lead a deputation of warriors who make sure the wee boy's okay to meet the Pope. So one thing we can say is that people started working when they were very young in this period, and that Charlemagne would have grown up, he'd been well educated, he's quickly trusted with a mission at the age of 6. He would have then learned to ride and to hunt. Age of maturity is about 14. By that age, he would be sexually active, and he'd be leading troops into battle. But nobody knew that he would survive childhood, and nobody knew that he was going to become Charlemagne. And Einhard, his friend, who writes his biography after he dies, says, we don't know much about Charlemagne's childhood. But I think Einhard must have heard stories, but they may have been about Charlemagne's rival with his brother. Einhard doesn't want to draw attention to conflict. But we don't know much about people's childhood in this period at all, about individuals' childhood.
So, but can we depict kind of sort of imagine what his childhood was like when it comes to, you know, general royal families and aristocratic families of that era? Can we depict kind of what, like you said, he learned how to hunt, he learned how to ride, etc. So is that, do we kind of depict from what life in general aristocratic and royal families was like?
Yes, he would have grown up with lots of other young people at the court, not just his own family, but with sons of the aristocracy would have come to court. So he'd grow up with people of his own age. He would share their interests in horse riding, in hunting, which is the great passion of the aristocracy. He would be probably quite well educated. His father, Peppin, had been educated in one of the great monasteries of the Frankish world, Saint Denis, just north of Paris. And so he would have learned perhaps Latin. He would have followed his father into battle as a teenager. Charlemagne and his brother Carloman, his younger brother. His mother would probably have an important influence. He does seem to have been very close to his mother. And he would have been, unlike his father, who wasn't brought up to be king, Charlemagne and his brother would be brought up to be kings, to be rule. And so his father would have selected wives for them from the aristocracy and things like that. And certainly by the time he's a teenager, he's certainly on campaign.
I mean, you mentioned his brother. I wanted to talk about him because he does the way I understood it, he dies at an early age, doesn't he? He eventually grow most of his families. He does have a sister, I think, but they don't really grow up. Most of them passes away quite early.
I think child mortality in the early Middle Ages is very high. And if you can get out of childhood, you can live quite a long time. Charlemagne lives really quite a long time, but he has a younger brother in the 750s and 760s who dies very young. Some of the other children die very young, but his sister, he's got one sister who lives right through into his own reign, and his brother Carloman, who is his rival, who becomes his rival, he survives for a few years after their father dies. But your family are a very paradoxical thing if you're a medieval aristocrat or ruler. They're your support, but they're also your rivals.
Lovely family reunions, I imagine.
Yes, the family unit must have been very tense. And he and his brother, because you divide the succession, in this period, it's not primogeniture, it's not the oldest son who inherits everything. Everything is divided. And that means none of the brothers ever feel they get enough. So you're absolutely programmed for conflict with your intimate family. And that means that all the aristocracy, they have to take sides as well. So it's built for conflict. It's built for rivalry. The
way I understood it, Carolo, his brother, he dies around 20, and isn't that right? He dies around the age of 20?
Yeah, he'd have been about 20. He's born in 751, dies in 773, I think. They're about 772, 773, I can't remember. So he's going to die about 21, 22. And it just seems to be an illness. He just died very young. And that's when Charlemagne pounces on his kingdom, and his brother's young children, Charlemagne's nephews, have to get away from their uncle, because you really don't want your uncle to look after you, because you're not going to survive if that happens. You're just not going to make it.
So how does this change for Charlemagne? I mean, it's a tremendous amount of power, and I imagine he getting. So how does he you said he rushes to the capital, but of the, what is the next when he finally gained power and
Well,
become king?
I think the things to remember about Charlemagne. So he gains power in 768 when his father dies, and Charlemagne and his brother divide up the kingdom. On his father's deathbed, the kingdom is divided, and again, Charlemagne's mother and the aristocracy play a role at the great sacred site of Saint Denis. So they have a very carefully staged death scene, and then both the brothers preside over the funeral of their father. So the ritual again is used to kind of bind the rupture that death causes, and then each of the boys goes to their kingdoms. I think the point to remember is that Charlemagne, he isn't Charlemagne yet. He's just Charles. He's not Charles the Great,
I
and
believe
nobody
his real
knows.
name is Carolo. Isn't that right?
Carolus, in
Yeah.
Latin, Karl in
Mm.
German. He'd be Karl, and he doesn't know he's Charlemagne. And he doesn't do everything himself. He's dependent on his warriors and his advisors, just as his brother is. What he's good at doing, I think he's very quick in his reactions, very decisive in his actions. When his brother dies, as I said, he moves on to the kingdom in a flash, and his brother's children and his brother's widow and some members of the aristocracy flee to Italy, which brings back the Lombards, because he and his brother had both been maneuvering for power in Italy and playing off the papacy against the Lombards in a very murky and complex triangle of politics. But with his brother's death, the Lombards now get a key card because Carloman's widow and children go to the court of the Lombard king, who has now Carolingian princes at his court. So this is a time bomb for Charlemagne, that these young princes are a kind of offstage threat to Charlemagne back in Francia, north of the Alps.
Mm. So is this when he just decided to go on his infamous Italy campaign?
This is indeed the trigger for Italy, but it does look as if Charlemagne was quite reluctant to go into Italy. That he is, what drives him into Italy? We're told it's because he wants to protect the papacy. We're told that he's a good, loyal son of the papacy, and that his dynasty and the popes have been close. But it's more likely that he goes in to try and neutralize the threat of these children. And we do have evidence that suggests he's trying to buy the Lombards. We've got evidence from sources in Rome, not in Francia, that Charlemagne offers the Lombards a huge amount of treasure for peace. And what would peace mean here? It may mean, if you give me the children. If you give me the children, then I won't invade. But the Lombards are overconfident, and I think they can keep Charlemagne under control and the popes under control, and they don't. They think he won't invade, and he does, and then very quickly he takes over the kingdom.
Is he hesitant because he thinks he can have, that they can have good relations with the Lombards, that it can be a valuable relationship, it's a good, bond between them?
Yes, I mean it's not a war of two ethnic groups clashing. He'd actually married a Lombard princess at one stage. In his attempt to make an alliance with the Lombards, he marries a Lombard princess, and the popes are appalled at this and write this terrible letter to both of the kings, Charlemagne and his brother, before the marriage, and they're not sure which one is going to marry a Lombard princess. And they say, oh, the Lombards are an inferior race. They are the source of leprosy. They are polluted. It's one of the very few sort of racist texts from the early Middle Ages. But the alliance doesn't work. And when Charlemagne sends that princess back to her father, this is an insult. This is an insult to the honor of the Lombards, and that must have made relations difficult.
She wasn't anything like the picture.
No. She's one of these women who are traded in this diplomatic network of women going across Europe to be traded in marriage to make alliances, and it's not a good thing for the women. And Charlemagne goes in, the Lombard kingdom falls, some of the Lombards go into exile, and he takes the title King of the Lombards. He doesn't abolish the kingdom, and he employs Lombards in his service. He executes some in the revolt,
Is it
but
more or
there's
less a
space for
puppet
Lombards in
state
his empire.
that he wants of the Lombards?
Sorry?
Is it more or less a puppet state that he wants of the Lombard, or does he want to rule it completely himself?
That's a good question. I don't know if he's thinking like that. His main interests are north of the Alps, so he's not going to stay in Lombardy, and he's thinking, like all politicians, he's thinking, how can I fix this immediate problem of absorbing a new kingdom he hadn't thought perhaps he'd be able to conquer? So he placates them by taking the title King of the Lombards, assuring them that they have an identity. He punishes them. He takes hostages north of the Alps for guarantees of good behavior. Eventually, he gives them one of his sons to be their king. But his priorities are north of the Alps.
I mean, you say it doesn't abolish the Lombard Empire, so
No.
I was thinking that maybe he wants them as puppets, rulers. That's his goal.
He is one thing. I mean, I wouldn't want to underestimate his ruthlessness and his harshness, because his nephews vanish from the historical record, and they'd have been young boys, and he may have had them killed because they're simply too dangerous to allow to survive. But it's not like the 20th century. It's really important. The Middle Ages wasn't a great period, but it's not like the 20th century with its racial and ideological determination to annihilate opposition and remove the traces of previous regimes. He can't afford to do that, and he doesn't have the ideological desire to do that. So yes, it's about keeping the Lombards on board because they're useful, and he can govern through them, as well as letting the Franks get jobs in Lombardy. So this is the beginning of expanding what will eventually become an empire. Yeah.
So let's talk about fortune and empire. How does it go on fortune and empire? And eventually, of course, we would get there as well. He just do get crowned by the Pope, which basically that's where later we would get the title Holy Roman Emperor, of course. But how does it go on fortune and empire before? Let's talk about this before he gets crowned by the Pope.
I think the phrase forging an empire is maybe one of the things to think about there. There are some historians who would argue he knows what he's doing. He's got a long-term plan. And there are historians who've argued, modern historians have argued, and it's an interesting argument, that he's thinking in big geopolitical terms. That what he really wants to do is expand the Franks into the east, because along the river Danube, there's the nomadic confederation of the Avars who've got a big treasure, and he wants this treasure. He wants the economic resources there. So in order to do that, you need to control northern Italy, and you need to control southern Germany. And that explains how he builds an empire. You take Italy, then you take Bavaria, and you can move along the Danube. And so there's a kind of geopolitical plan right from the start. I'm more skeptical. I don't think politicians always have these plans, and if they do, the plans don't always survive encounter with reality. It kind of builds an empire by accident, that he's responding to challenges on the frontier with the Saxons. He's responding to the dangerous challenge of the Duke of Bavaria. And then, over time, where he does think about forging an empire, I think you're right there, is maybe in the 790s. And that's when he's beginning to look like a different kind of ruler. By then, he's not just another barbarian warlord. There's something different about him at that time. So one answer to your question is time. It takes him time for him and his advisors to become conscious of what they're doing. I'm inclined to think as a young ruler, he's responding to challenges and opportunities, and maybe not got a master plan. By the 790s, it's rather different.
So he doesn't like he want to conquer the entire Europe as a whole. He doesn't have that kind of ambitions.
No, he doesn't have that. I really don't think he does. He's too busy. He's a very busy man. We tend to divide up the reign into the years of war, then the years of empire, the years of culture, the years of government. He's doing all these things at exactly the same time. And so his lived experience is not compartmentalized the way we tend to compartmentalize it, as we have to, so we can analyze it and understand it. He's in the middle of it. And I think, like a lot of politicians, he's an opportunist. He is creative. By the 790s, some sort of vision is beginning to emerge, I think. But it really does take time.
So he chooses Aachen as a capital. Is there a strategical reason why he chooses Aachen as a capital there?
Well, I think if you've read that biography by Johannes Fried, the German historian, he says it's because he loves swimming, and you've got the hot water at Aachen, you've got the hot bath.
Yeah, I remember that when you mentioned it. Yeah.
Yeah, and Fried, who always likes to be provocative and kind of try and reimagine the past in new ways, is I think being provocative there. But it's a good reason. I think Aachen.
There's no strategic reason that it's a strategic location like Constantinople or Rome was for the Roman Empire. So that's a kind of thing.
No, it's not. It's not quite that. It is a complicated question. It's a complicated topic, and even calling it a capital is it's not quite. I mean, I think you're right. I think it does in the 790s and later. It does become his favored residence, his favorite palace, but it's not his only palace. It's near the lands of his family. It's near a lot of royal lands. It's well placed for hunting. It's a palace that his father liked. It's a palace. It's an area that he likes. And certainly at the end of the 780s and beginning of the 790s, he starts a massive building project there. It is the grandest of all his palaces. And the word capital city is maybe slightly anachronistic because it's like London or Oslo or Washington or Paris, which continue to function even if the prime minister or the president isn't there. Government functions. Not quite like that in the Middle Ages, but it's the grandest of his residencies. And yes, I think it's the center of the realm by the 790s and early 800s.
We discussed this in the whole Roman Empire, which is maybe around 20, 30 episodes ago. And we discussed that emperors, they would travel a lot during the reign to talk to the people and ask for their problems and not necessarily fix it, but they would not necessarily stay in the capital like you said, and they would just travel around their empire to talk to the common people.
It's a more mobile world in some ways than modern capitals, because in modern capitals the administration remains the same. He's different from the two rulers in Europe at this time who stay put, speaking very broadly, are the popes in Rome and the emperors in Constantinople. The Frankish rulers travel, but they don't spend all their time traveling. As Charlemagne gets older, he spends the winters in Aachen. Everything slows down in this period in the winter. The family gathers around him, the court scholars gathers around him, and he's got this great setting for them. If you wanted to find Charlemagne, you would need to ask people where he was, and people know about the itinerary. Letters of his friend from England, Alcuin, are full of information about where the king's going to be this year and how you can meet the king. But by the time you get after the year 800, Aachen's a good bet for finding him. And it looks different from his other palaces. The Roman element that you mentioned, he's learned from Roman cities like Ravenna. He's obviously very impressed by Ravenna, which is one of the ancient Roman capitals, because he strips it of a lot of its decoration and architecture and brings that north of the Alps to Aachen, including a statue of the great barbarian ruler Theodoric the Ostrogoth. And that's brought to Aachen to adorn this Ravenna north of the Alps.
If we go to Aachen today, and if we travel there, can we see traces and remains of Charlemagne's reign today if we go to visit the city?
Some does. The great hall of the palace is gone, and the chapel, the church that was part of his palace, is incorporated into the Gothic cathedral and was restored in the 19th century. But effectively, that center of the Gothic cathedral is Charlemagne's church. And you can see the throne on the upper floor, which we now are pretty sure dates from Charlemagne's reign. And that would have enabled him to look down on the altar during the services. And so the decoration and the architectural design of Aachen, as you know, it's an 8-sided chapel, and it's full of number symbolism. And the symbolism might be referring to the apocalypse, the end of history, and the final unfolding of God's plan. It's meant to recall Jerusalem as well as the heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly Jerusalem. Even though it's built before he's emperor, there's obviously some very, very ambitious thinking going into it. And you can still see that. And although when you go to Aachen, we can't always work out the numbers ourselves, the sheer splendor of the building is still immensely impressive over 1,000 years later. It's really worth a trip. Really
I mean, something I found fascinating reading Johannes Fried's Charlemagne is that he mentioned that his court was quite varied of people, different people from Anglo-Saxon world, Irish people even,
yes,
and a lot from all over basically, and a lot of races represented the
yes,
Arctic court. So let's talk. I found that fascinating. So let's talk about the court of
the
Charlemagne
court.
for a bit, which I found quite fascinating.
Oh, I think the court is really remarkable, and we're lucky we know so much about it. We know about it because, well, we've got the buildings of Aachen and some other palaces. We've got letters from Alcuin, the man from England. We have poems by a lot of the poets, Alcuin from England, Theodulf from Spain. We've got letters about astronomy from Irish scholars writing to Charles at the court. And we know about the women at the court. And that's one of the striking things about Charlemagne's court, is that the women are very prominent, not just the queens, but also his mistresses, and as the reign goes on, his daughters. And one of the interesting things about the court is, to go back to your earlier point about it being a capital, even if the people aren't at the court, they're thinking about it. We've got a sequence of poems that describe the court. This Spanish writer, Theodulf, who's a Visigoth, comes from Spain, he's at court in the 790s. He writes a poem, a very long poem, that describes people at the court and tells you what it's like to be at court. But he's not at court when he writes it. He writes it as a letter to the court to remind the people at the court about himself. So when people are away at the court, they're thinking about the court and they want people at the court to remember them. And they do it through this very particular medium of communication, a highly complex Latin poem, which refers to people at the court by their nicknames. And so if you've got nicknames, you've got an elite group. You've got a group of people who know each other, who are relaxed with each other, but who can exclude people who are not part of that group. So you get this classic court culture, which is about access and closing access and defining people, who's in and who's out.
So we mentioned Irish and Anglo-Saxons being in the court of Charlemagne. So how does the even Irish people, which is quite far away from Aachen, and Anglo-Saxons, how did they end up in the court of Charlemagne?
I suppose one answer is money. That the great lords of the Middle Ages are great patrons, and they will pay money for craftsmen. And so you get work, for example, we've got a beautiful cross, a beautiful chalice from Bavaria that is possibly, some of the design looks a bit like the kind of design you get in the British Isles, including Ireland. And it may be a craftsman from there who got employment with the Duke of Bavaria. And the great poets, the great writers, the great scholars know that Charlemagne's an open-handed patron. He's a talent spotter. And so he will give them employment, he will give them rewards, he will give them promotion, and he will expect work from them. They will work for the regime. They will write poems glorifying the king. They will write poems saying how generous the king is. And if you write a poem praising the king's generosity, you're also encouraging the king to be generous and saying, could you give me a bit more money for being a poet? But you also get jobs in the administration. And he is open to bringing in people from all corners of Europe. The Lombards are there, the Spaniards are there, the Franks are there, the Irish and Anglo-Saxons are there, because it's an international society. That way, Latin is a common language, Christianity is a common religion, but the open-handedness of the great he's the Lord of the Rings. That's what Lord of the Rings means. It means the great patron, the giver of gold, the giver of treasure, the giver of jobs. So it's a magnet. And the more people that go, then the more your reputation goes, and then the more people want to come.
Now we do have actually, and I don't remember, I don't think it was in the Johannes Fried's book that I read this, but it's somewhere else where we had the envoys from Al-Andalus as well, Islamic Spain, trying to get into Charlemagne's court. But the way I understood this, they weren't really accepted. They had to wait too long, and that wasn't interested in Al-Andalus. While we are going to talk about his failed campaign in Spain later, he didn't accept the envoys from Al-Andalus, as I understood it.
Well, I think different historians take different views from Johannes Fried and Janet Nelson in her wonderful biography of Charlemagne has got some things to say about this. This is an area that interests people now more than it did maybe about a generation or 2 generations ago, because of the dimension of the Islamic presence in Europe, and the way that's something people talk about now in modern society. The envoys from Spain in the 770s, who track him down in Saxony, seem to offer him an invitation to intervene in the politics of Islamic Spain, and he's quite happy to do that. The envoys from...
I understood that they were rejected, that he rejected the envoys from Islamic Spain.
Well, no, I don't think it's as straightforward as that. I think he goes to Spain, but he goes to Spain on his own terms. He doesn't necessarily do what they want him to do. I would agree with that, yes. I would agree with that. But he's also got relationships, as you know, with the Caliph in Baghdad.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that right after, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and of course, you mentioned it, and I want to talk about that now, because it seems... Because how does he end up having a relationship with Harun al-Rashid? Baghdad is quite far away. It would take at least 3 years one way, I think, to get to Baghdad. So how does he manage to get a relation? It wasn't like sending an email or taking a plane, which would take 3 hours, not 3 years, but it would take quite a while. So how does he end up having a good relationship with... I wouldn't hesitate calling good, but how does he end up having a relationship sort of with Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid Caliph at the time?
Well, I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of the reign, although it's maybe not the most significant, but it's really interesting.
He does even request an elephant as well, doesn't he?
He gets an elephant. You're absolutely right. He gets an elephant. We don't know if he asks for one, but he gets one. And this is the great gift of a great ruler. It is clear that in this period, the most significant power, as far as, if you're thinking about the Mediterranean and east of the Mediterranean, the most significant power is the new dynasty in the Islamic world, the Abbasids, and the creation of Baghdad, a much bigger center than Aachen. And so from Baghdad's point of view, it costs nothing to send an elephant to a barbarian ruler in the West. This is small change, and you can do it and make the barbarian ruler feel good, and it costs you nothing. On another level, Charlemagne's very interested in the Middle East. He's very interested in Jerusalem. And he's interested in Jerusalem. Aachen is meant to echo Jerusalem. He gives money to churchmen and churchwomen, to nuns in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem's under Islamic rule, but had been part of the Byzantine Empire. And it may be that both Charlemagne and the Caliph are thinking, let's ignore the Byzantine Empire here, and Charlemagne can play at being a global figure, whereas the Caliph really is a global figure. And he thinks, well, I'll just be nice to the Frankish ruler because he's not a problem for me, and it might offend the Byzantines.
It's on the other side of the world.
Yeah, effectively the other side of the world. And the Caliph, he's not controlling Spain at this time, so it's not like he's going to launch an invasion from Spain. They've got other things to do. It's diplomacy on a big scale, but it's very hard to grasp its true significance. It matters to Charlemagne, I think, because it's written, people are amazed that an elephant arrives, and eventually...
Did he want to use it as a war elephant? Or just amusement?
He's going to take it north to fight the Vikings at one stage. This seems to be part of their plan, but sadly...
That would have been quite a shock.
It would have been fantastic. It really would have been fantastic. It would be like that bit in the final bit of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Return of the King, when the kind of elephant figures turn up and Legolas jumps on top of an elephant and fires his arrows.
That only count as one.
Yes, you wonder if it would be like that. But in fact, it's in the tradition of rulers sending each other exotic animals. And later 9th century sources, looking back at Charlemagne, say that he sent magnificent hunting dogs to Baghdad, which he might or might not have done, because rulers give each other great gifts. But Jerusalem's more important to him than Baghdad, and that's what he's thinking about. And he's got invested money there. And people from Jerusalem attend the imperial coronation in Rome in 800, which is very significant, I think.
And of course, this brings me to next, and that when they've been talking about this earlier, the crowning of Charlemagne by the Pope. How does that happen? How does that come about? Because it doesn't call himself leader of the Romans yet, does it? That's a later invention, so to speak. But how does it go about getting crowned by the Pope?
It's a really complicated. In some ways, it's very simple. In other ways, it's very complicated. Some historians think it's bound to happen. In the 790s, he's holding this great meeting at Frankfurt in 794, where he takes on the Byzantine Empire, says your theology is wrong, where he takes on heresy in Spain, which is not part of his empire. He's already posing as an emperor. Other historians say it's an accident. The Pope is attacked in the year 799 in a riot in Rome. He appeals to Charlemagne for help, and that triggers the imperial coronation, which is really a kind of accident to help get the Pope out of trouble. I think it's a combination of the two. It is the Pope's in trouble and the Pope needs a strong protector from the north. But Charlemagne's advisors say, well, this isn't just a normal crisis. Alcuin, the Englishman, writes to Charlemagne and says, if you look at the world, there are three great figures who control the world. One is the Pope, and he's in trouble. The other one is the Byzantine Emperor, the Emperor of the New Rome, and he's been blinded by his mother, the Empress Irene. So they're in trouble. So you, Charlemagne, are the only figure left to keep things going. So it's your responsibility to step up and save the papacy and save the Oecumene, save the realms.
Is this because it doesn't really call himself emperor at this point, does he? Is this where he start calling himself imperator or emperor at this point?
That's one of the key questions about what happens in 800. Charlemagne's great friend Einhard, who writes the famous biography of him after Charlemagne dies, has the famous story that Charlemagne was surprised on Christmas Day 800 when the Pope crowned him emperor. Einhard says that Charlemagne told him that if he'd known what was going to happen that day, he wouldn't have gone to church in Rome on Christmas Day. And it's impossible to believe that Charlemagne was surprised. What Einhard is saying here is that Charlemagne's modest and, was saying he didn't think he was worthy to be emperor. But it's been planned. Back in 799, he sent monks over to Jerusalem and they turn up in Rome on Christmas Day 800. So they know where to be, they know where to go, and they know when to come back. The preparation for the coronation would have been intense. But yes, he doesn't immediately work out what it means to be emperor. It takes him, I think, a few years to work out what has changed and what that means for him. And that's an interesting topic.
Well, it's kind of, we're discussing in our episode of Caligula, which I did last year, that he was really the first emperor of Rome, not the others. It was just a formal title until Caligula, because he had absolute power. So it's kind of the same here, I think, that it was just a title at first. And then later he kind of, okay, now I know what it means.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the good point. The emperor itself as a title is something that changes and develops. Yeah. So from Augustus to Caligula to Diocletian or to Constantine, it's continually changing. The thing I think to remember about 800 and Charlemagne's coronation is that he's not the only player. The popes aren't entirely passive. Pope Leo III, who's a very shifty
Was it kind of like I was hesitant calling him off? I think that you do me a favor, I do you a favor, kind of thing.
It's a bit of that. And a Byzantine source says that's exactly how the Byzantines look at this, because they think, well, how can he be emperor? Because we're the emperors.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to that, actually, because, unlike the 19th century and early 20th century, everyone was either Tsar, Kaiser, or emperor of whatever realm, Habsburg, Germany, etc., where it didn't really mean anything. But in those times, being emperor was quite controversial, having a different emperor, right? Where as the Byzantines were the only real emperors as they saw it.
And so in some ways it is it's the revival of it's a Roman title. So he's a Roman emperor. We have a coin in which he's got the laurel wreath, and he's called Emperor Augustus, the August emperor. And that looks as if he's taking it very seriously. And I think in many ways he did take the title very seriously, but he doesn't produce that coin until 12 years later. So why does he wait? And one answer to that is he wants to be recognized by the Byzantine imperial powers.
Yeah, because we talked about like this earlier, and you said that if it might have been a man or different case, he would have accepted him as emperor. But Irene kind of realized that it could be a useful potential ally, perhaps, and I think this is what Johannes Fried argues as well, that she really accepted his emperorship because she looked at him as being a useful ally to her.
Yes, that there are stories in the sources that there was a marriage proposal that maybe Charlemagne could marry Irene, and that does seem almost absurd. To get back to your point about geography, Aachen's very far away from Constantinople. Rome's quite far away from Constantinople. You can't really imagine them setting up house together, but maybe it really means a close political alliance, because she's in trouble in Constantinople by that time. What does happen is that, yes, there's some tension between the Franks and the Byzantines. Irene is deposed. Franks and Byzantines clash over claims to Italy, which is the key part of the Mediterranean both of them want to have influence over. But by about 811, 812, Charlemagne lets the Byzantines have control of Venice. That's quite an expensive thing to give away. Venice is a very useful place to have.
It's not a Venetian Empire yet.
It's not yet the Venetian Empire. You're right. We shouldn't project back. You're absolutely right. But it's still a significant concession he makes to the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and they send an envoy to Aachen. They send ambassadors to Aachen who chant the imperial hymns of praise to Charlemagne at that time, 811, 812, and that's when we think he issues the coin. The coins with his imperial title and his imperial appearance, and very few of them were issued. And it looks as if he then thinks, because Charlemagne knows popes don't make emperors. Emperors make emperors. And although he gets crowned by Leo III, the Pope, Charlemagne must have known that's not how Roman emperors are made. We tend to think it is how emperors are made because we're very familiar with the medieval empire and the Holy Roman Empire, but it's quite a radical move by the papacy in the year 800. It's a very daring and creative move by a pope who's more than just a tricky and slippery individual. He's got some high-powered thinking going on in the Curia as well.
So, for something we haven't discussed yet, and I'm not sure if you already done this, if you are had to go back to the time. I'm sorry about if I did mix up a little bit right now, but I was in our Viking episode we discussed how Saint Olav, one of Norway's only saints, Christianized Norway. It was either you become Christian or you get your head chopped off, and they called it the Charlemagne method. So let's talk about the Christianization of the Germany and the empire. So how does it go about? Was it as brutal as Saint Olav in Norway would be a few hundred years later, or how did he go about Christianizing his empire?
If we look at what happens east of the Rhine in Saxony, the pagan landscape east of the Rhine, well, historians would dispute that, but let's call it pagan. It doesn't have an organized church. And in this campaign of 20 or 30 years, it's astonishingly brutal. It really is very brutal indeed. It involves massacres of unarmed prisoners. It involves massive physical destruction. It involves deportation of people. It involves the destruction of the indigenous culture. It involves the imposition of Christian belief through fire and sword. We have a piece of legislation, the First Saxon Capitulary, that's probably issued, we should imagine it being issued by an army, that Charlemagne and his army are going through Saxony saying, if you don't get your children baptized, the penalty is death. If you eat meat in Lent, the penalty is death. And this would have been a world that wouldn't have had churches where you could take your children to be baptized, where you wouldn't have calendars telling you when Lent began, so you don't know when to stop eating sausages, it doesn't mean that they did kill everybody who disobeyed. It's just the message would have been one of terror. He also does other messages of enticement, but this would be conversion at the point of a sword. And so people refer to Charlemagne as one of the apostles, but the apostle with the tongue of iron, meaning the relentless preaching, but also the sword. So but what you're doing with compulsory conversion is, according to medieval beliefs, you're saving people, because pagans will go to hell and will burn. Just as Christians who believe wrongly will also burn. And so you're saving people.
Well, I just thought my fate sealed then.
Sorry?
That's my fate sealed.
Yes, yes. Well, luckily, we don't live in the Middle Ages.
Mm.
But and so the Christianization is, on the one hand, in Saxony, militarized and a ferocious compulsion, but it's also then the long work of building churches, teaching, training, social adaptation. But he's also doing the same in his own realms, the Christian parts of Francia. He's not using an army to do it, but he's also determined to impose certain kinds of standards of behavior and belief.
Wasn't more or less an early version of Spanish Inquisition in a sense?
I think it is about checking up on people. It is about trying to bring people up to a certain level of standard. It's about making sure people don't listen to magicians, that people don't follow witches. To some extent, he's trying to save people from con men. The legislation for his own people says, look, if somebody's going around saying that they've had a letter from Jesus Christ, tell the local bishop, because Charlemagne thinks people don't get letters from Jesus Christ. And he's
I just spent time with Jesus here, just let me show you.
Yeah. And a letter, because in the 8th century, you get stories of people going around and saying, oh, just a letter fell from the sky and it's from Jesus, and I'm a special person. So part of it is about some of it is about making life a lot duller by saying, no, nothing of this is true. You've got to really check up with the authorities. Some of it is about social control, of course, and some of it is about social protection. But the big legislation he issues from Aachen in 789, called the General Warning, the General Admonition, is about disciplining Christian society and ensuring people follow norms. How successful that is, hard to judge, and it takes decades for that kind of thing to work. But the conquest of the Saxons is part of his mission as a Christian ruler, and he's a deeply Christian ruler who happens to have hands stained with blood of his own nephews, possibly, and certainly the Saxons and his opponents. But he is a deeply, deeply Christian figure, and it's about imposing the correct norms as he and his advisors see it. And it's about his responsibility. This is because he knows he will answer to this, to God in the next life. And that's a very scary thought.
Now, you mentioned that he did go to Spain himself as an envoy, but he also tried to attack Spain and wage war on Islamic Spain. But it does fail, doesn't it? So how come that is he trying to kind of do a new Battle of Tours in a sense, or is he trying to take back the Islamic Spain? I
think that he doesn't think of Spain as Islamic Spain, that in this period, the Franks and the Christians of the West don't really understand what Islam is. They don't like it, and they see the Muslims as infidels, but they don't. But infidel just means not faithful, and you would say the same about rebels who were Christians, or you'd say the same about heretics, and they tend to think of Islam and not as a separate religion, but maybe as a heresy. They're still quite puzzled by it. He's perfectly happy to ally with some Islamic figures in Spain, but yes, he does conduct military campaigns in Spain. The campaign in 778 is a famous failure, but that's on the way back when he's attacked by the Basques. That's the famous battle at Roncesvalles when Roland fights the rearguard action and dies heroically. In the 11th century, Western Europe, that becomes a kind of proto-crusade story of Charlemagne's army fighting against Muslim infidels. That's not what happens in 778. A few years later, yes, the Franks do expand into Islamic Spain and conquer Barcelona. So it's not all failure. They push down into Barcelona. Charlemagne's son Louis succeeds in capturing Barcelona, but they have no plans to, as far as we can see, to conquer the whole of Spain or to stand. It's not like a kind of Cold War between superpowers at this period. It's not really like what's going to change in the era of the Crusades. Although some historians now, a younger generation of historians now, are looking at this in new ways and saying there's maybe more going on here than we thought.
So, of course, it's something you haven't discussed while you mentioned them. You mentioned the elephant against the Vikings, which would have been spectacular.
Yes.
But they do come in and they do cause trouble for Charlemagne as well when they enter the European scene, don't they? And he does seem to have a bit of a problem with Denmark.
Yeah. Yes.
Because it's quite close to his empire.
Yes. Yes.
So
absolutely.
let's talk about the Vikings in Charlemagne's reign.
This is it's round about the period when Charlemagne's at the peak of his powers, the 800 crowned emperor and getting the elephant, exactly as you say. It's exactly at this period that our evidence starts telling us about the emergence of these piratical figures in Western Europe, attacking holy islands off the British Isles coast, Lindisfarne, in the east, Iona, off the coast of Scotland, and also the northern French coastline. And Charlemagne, we know, builds defences along that coastline, and he's very worried about the Danish king, who is maybe not as powerful as Charlemagne, but who's able to mobilize very significant forces. And so Einhard, again in his biography of Charlemagne, it is clear that the Franks are worried about King Godfried of Denmark.
They do try to settle peace, I think, at some point, but it doesn't work out.
Yes,
I think because Charlemagne isn't there, right? And then Knut is trying to stands him up or something, right?
It's Charlemagne is pretty shocked after 800 when the Danes seem to be threatening the northern part of his kingdom, and he mobilizes an army. In 811 or so, there's a treaty between the Franks and the Danes, and we have the names of the very high-ranking Frankish warriors and churchmen who preside over the treaty. So it's very, very serious. Luckily for the Franks, the Danish king dies, he's assassinated, and then there's a quarrel among the Danish royal family, and that keeps them busy. It's in the next generation that the warriors from the north really make their impact. The problem for the Franks is they've been too successful. They've pushed east and north and come into the Scandinavian orbit. And that fighting for supremacy of trade and piracy and influence in the Baltic and in the North Sea, where the naval powers of Scandinavia really have a powerful hand to play, is going to be very problematic for the Franks after Charlemagne's death. At the later years of his reign, this is a shadow on the horizon, a cloud on the horizon. It's not yet the problem it's going to become. But I think you're right. I think there's something at the court. They are worried about the King of Denmark after 800. Yeah, he's a significant figure for them.
I think they do have a meeting, but Charlemagne doesn't show up, and it kind of pisses off the King of Denmark. I'm not quite sure.
I can't remember if he's meant to go to that meeting, but if you think of what the Danes are doing, they build this great earthwork across the Danevirke in the south of Denmark, across the peninsula. So they're able to mobilize labor. They've got the ocean-going ships. He's got a warrior aristocracy, and they've got all the Frankish shop windows on their door. The expansion of Frankish Empire, the building of churches, means you've basically built a lot of banks full of gold and treasure right on the frontier with Scandinavia, which is an open invitation to Scandinavian warriors who start doing in the 9th century what Charlemagne the Franks did in the 8th century, just smash and grab raids everywhere.
And of course, something we haven't discussed yet, and you mentioned Louis the Pious, of course, is Charlemagne's sons and daughters.
Yes.
Because it does quite, of course, nobody ends up following the rules, but it does create quite some strict rules for them to follow, which doesn't go quite as well as he hoped it would. Because of course it wouldn't. So let's talk about those rules and the relationship with his sons.
Yeah, that's one of the, for me, that's one of the most interesting parts of the reign. One of the most interesting aspects of the reign is that at the heart of this huge empire, 1 million square kilometers, where there's loads of people who you would never have seen Charlemagne, and most people on a sunny Wednesday like today would be out working in the fields and not really thinking about the royal family. But at the heart of that empire is a family, and it's a very quarrelsome family. One of Charlemagne's sons Pippin the Hunchback, rises in revolt against his father because he feels he's not getting a share of the inheritance, and seems to have planned to kill not only his father, but to kill his brothers. Pippin is then locked away in a monastery. After the year 800, Charlemagne's getting quite old now. His sons have become mature, and they're wondering when will they get their inheritance. And so he does divide up the empire in the year 806. As you see, this very elaborate plan for the three legitimate sons who have not rebelled against him. And he says some interesting things in that document. He works out how he's going to divide the empire up among all three of them. He doesn't give any of them the imperial title, which is quite strange. He reminds them that their sisters, his daughters, should be allowed to get married if they want to.
But it doesn't happen, does it?
No. And Charlemagne famously doesn't allow his daughters to marry. And he keeps them at court, where they're very useful to him because they're members of the family and they're close to him, but without allowing them to get married, they can't form dynasties of their own to challenge him. And you can't keep the lid on that all the time. And I think the sons are getting more and more impatient.
I think it says that they're not allowed to be sent to a monastery either, which would have been a...
And of course, what happens when he dies is the first thing the surviving son does is send all his sisters into nunneries. I think what they're all doing in these later years of the reign is they're all making bargains. That Charlemagne, he doesn't, when his wife dies in 800, he doesn't marry again. And I think the sons...
Was there some genuine affection there?
Well, I think that Charlemagne is a ruler who enjoys women's company, perhaps excessively by the standards of some churchmen, but he's a man who enjoys the company of men, he enjoys the company of women, he's a very outgoing figure in that way. But I think the sons have told him, no more queens after this. We're the only legitimate sons you're going to have. And at this period, it really doesn't matter enormously if you're legitimate or illegitimate, but it can be made to matter. So I think the sons are putting some pressure on him, and the daughters are saying, okay, we agree not to get married as long as you're alive, Dad, but you've got to allow us to get married when you die because we've got to look after ourselves. And so he tries to tell the rest of the family, the girls must be allowed to get married, but none of this works out, as you said.
Here's the thing, though. If he doesn't want his daughters to marry from dynasties, why doesn't he send them to nunneries, which would seem the easiest solution to the problem?
Well, they do have convents to go to, but they're too useful to be at court. They provide a glamour at court, and they provide, some historians have said, they're like the equivalent, the daughters at Charlemagne's court in Aachen, especially after 800, and some of them go to Rome for the coronation, so they're very prominent figures. And we know that they have sexual liaisons with powerful Frankish aristocrats, so they're useful at creating informal alliances. But some historians have said they're kind of like the eunuchs at the court of the Byzantine emperor. These are special figures, the daughters. Since they're not allowed to get married, they can't challenge him, and their only source of power, just like eunuchs at the Byzantine court, their only source of power is the ruler. So they owe everything to the ruler. So it's a way in which he can control them, and also they can grant and control access. So they get prominence, but he gets dependence. They're too useful for him to send away. And I think he's genuinely fond of their company.
So of course he's quite old, like you said, and eventually he passes away. So how quickly does it, and what does it fall? Because as you know, I don't think we need to ask why in this case, because as we know, they don't get along quite well, his sons and sisters. So how quickly does it fall apart after his death, the empire he forged?
Well, I think there's the exciting events of his death and his son Louis the Pious coming to court, and the fights within the imperial family. But you're asking a bigger question, and I think the quick answer to the question about how quickly does it fall apart is not quickly at all. Not quickly at all. That the empire remains united under his son, who in many ways runs a more sophisticated version of empire than Charlemagne does. So up until the year 840, the empire's united. How united and how effective it is, that's a separate question. When Louis the Pious dies, famously the empire's divided up among his three sons in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. But the notion of empire remains, and it's reunited, perhaps superficially, in the 880s. So it's not until the end of the 880s, really, that the unitary territory controlled by this family falls apart. But I would agree that by the middle of the 9th century, the title emperor is usually held by people south of the Alps, by the branch line of the family south of the Alps. It's a very different world. But it doesn't go into a straight decline. This is, I think, the kind of research that people were doing when I was a student was all about re-evaluating Charlemagne's successors and trying to get away from the shadow of Charlemagne, which of course is stretched into the modern era, the reputation of the great emperor, the great king.
So now, when does it start being called Holy Roman Emperor? Holy Roman Empire and title of Holy Roman Emperor, because it doesn't happen until after Charlemagne's death.
No, I've always told my students it's not helpful to call it the Holy Roman Empire in this period. And on the whole, I myself, as a person who studies the history before the year 1000, I tend to think of it as being very late. But the idea of the empire being sacred, the Sacrum Imperium, the Holy Empire, very old idea. The title of Roman Empire, which is a kind of transnational title, even if German kings are holding it. I think, by the time you get to the 12th century, on the whole, medievalists, modern historians who study the Middle Ages, I think, tend to call the empire until about the year 1200. And then after the great German dynasties lose control of it, maybe after that, we might call it the Holy Roman Empire for the later Middle Ages until 1806, when famously Napoleon just calls the whole show to a halt. But then the Austro-Hungarian Empire emerges in the 19th century. But I just think the term Holy Roman Empire is not immensely helpful as a description for what we're looking at in this period.
What would you say the legacy of Charlemagne is?
That's a huge question. That's a really, really huge question. And I don't think we've got time to go into it. I suppose you could say that each age looks back at him for different things. The great paintings of him in the 16th century by Albrecht Dürer are all about the Holy Roman Empire. The medieval epics about the Song of Roland and the like are about the Crusades and about chivalry. The quarrels in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, a very famous quarrel breaks out among historians and members of the Nazi Party about, was it Charlemagne or Karl der Große? Was he a French king or a German king? And in Hitler's entourage, there are some people who think, well, Charlemagne's a terrible figure because he attacked the Saxons, who are the true Germans, pagan, live in forests and worship pagan gods.
Yeah, I forgot about that when you mentioned it, that he does use Charlemagne as a propaganda figure in Nazi Germany as well.
Yeah, and and I think one of these quarrels of the 1930s is instructive for our own times, because we tend to think in our own times of Twitter and social media, it's a world where arguments don't matter. What matters is who's shouting loudest. In a way, that's happening in Germany in the 1930s, that these serious academic historians who put together a little collection of essays, was he Charlemagne or was he Karl der Große? Was he Charlemagne, Charles the Great in French, or Charles the Great in German? They're attempting, as their social duty as citizens, to get out of the university and speak to a broad public, but they're up against a regime that isn't very interested in academic argument at all. So that's part of the chapter of his legacy. The other thing is, nowadays, I suppose, he looks less important than he did, say, in the late 20th century. After 1945, the division of Europe into communist and capitalist Europe, Charlemagne's adopted by West Germany as the good German who helped found the European Union, who brought France and Germany together. With the collapse of communism in 1989, it reminds us Europe's a lot bigger than Charlemagne's empire. And he looks, in some ways, less significant, as we're interested now in global history. In some ways, he looks a less significant figure. Still interesting, but a less significant figure.
I forgot to ask this when we recorded the episode about how the Roman Empire, because with Peter Wilson, and he does argue at the end of this book as well that while European Union doesn't have a standing army, it doesn't have an army in that sense. Would you say that the European Union is more or less a revival of the Holy Roman Empire 2.0?
This is what some people have argued, and I think that takes us into the big question of what is Europe, and you and I are speaking from countries that were never part of Charlemagne's empire and not part of the Holy Roman Empire. And that question of what is Europe and what's Charlemagne's legacy in Europe is a very hot political question. And here it's Charlemagne's grandfather, who's maybe more significant, Charles Martel. And you will know that parties of right-wing parties in modern Europe are quite interested in Charles Martel, who fights the Muslim army in the 730s. And Charles Martel is in some ways now, for very strange reasons, a more resonant figure than Charlemagne, because of this idea that Europe is essentially Christian and that Islam is not part of Europe's history. And this is just historically false. It's just a historically false idea. It's not a matter of being political.
They should pick up a history book in Islamic Spain, because as I think is the case that Islamic Spain has been longer than what current Spain after Isabella and Ferdinand is from 1400. That it's been ruling longer than what current Spain is.
That might be true, or about the same time.
I think so.
It's conquered in 711. Conquered in 711. So these questions are exactly the kind of questions that historians need to grapple with. And so looking back on a figure who died in the year 814, well over 1,000 years ago, whose legacy is a very mixed legacy, there are ways in which it's still very much alive. And has been alive in the 20th century, in the 19th century, when Napoleon, even as he's getting rid of the Holy Roman Empire, says, when he's been crowned emperor for France, he says, as far as the Pope is concerned, I am Charlemagne. And yet there's also little trivial things like a French pop song from the 1960s that criticizes Charlemagne because he made everybody go to school. And I can't remember the name of the woman who sang it, but it's a fun wee song.
And of course, Christopher Lee made a metal album about Charlemagne.
Yes, of course. I'd forgotten the most important legacy of all is the Christopher Lee heavy metal album about Charlemagne and the Saxons.
What do you think about it, though? If you heard it,
I'm a big fan of Christopher Lee. I'm a big fan of Christopher Lee, and I think it's striking that it picks out the massacre of the Saxons. I mean, if you're going to do a heavy metal album, that's the kind of place you're going to go. But it picks out the slaughter of the Saxons. But again, that kind of, without trying to minimize the brutality of these wars, they're not like the wars of the 20th century, wars of annihilation and wars of ideological commitment to wiping people out. It doesn't mean if you're a Saxon victim of Charlemagne, it doesn't mean it's any nicer knowing this, but Charlemagne's not Stalin. He's not Hitler. It's the real monsters of history are not these medieval rulers. It's the 20th century with them, Pol Pot, Stalin, Hitler, who are aberrant figures. And the wars, for all their horror, that Christopher Lee's album evokes, so interestingly, are not quite the same as the wars of our own culture in the 20th and 21st century.
I mean, it's surprising that he uses Charlemagne and not Charles Martel, because he seems more like a fitting figure for Hitler to be used as a propaganda fighting infidels.
Yeah, and actually Charlemagne is less important to Hitler, I suppose, than Rome. It's the Roman legacy, and even Hitler thought some of his followers were nutters on this Germanic nonsense. But these currents are not entirely gone. And yes, the SS division Charlemagne, which is I think the French Nazis who joined that, just as the Viking division was I think some of the British.
And of course, you got the Operation Barbarossa, which is named after the Roman Emperor Barbarossa.
Yeah. So these figures from the past can be used, have been used, and are used after 1945. Charlemagne's used as a kind of benevolent figure who brings Europe together. And it's vital for Western Europe to think in these terms, because it's trying to stop what seemed like the endless wars between France and Germany. So he became useful in the 1960s.
And it probably will be used again as well later, I imagine.
Yes, and there's still, the city of Aachen still awards the Charlemagne Prize for people who have helped European unity. And Aachen still proud of Charlemagne, and there's still a prize given in his honor. So
it's understandable.
Yeah, so there's still some evocation. Yes, there is. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to talk with you about Charlemagne. And before you go, do you have anything you wish to promote? Where can people find your book if they want to read it? I know I cannot wait to read it myself.
That's
so where can people find your books? Do you have anything you want me to put in the description below? Yeah,
that's
perhaps.
very kind of you. The book is published by Bloomsbury, and it's just out in paperback. And I hope people enjoy it. I spent a very long time writing it, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you about the great king and his family and his history. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. Please, if you like this episode, please make sure to check out some of our other episodes. I'm sure you're going to find something you like. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Apple Podcast, please consider writing a little review of my podcast. That would help us out a lot. This book is, and again, I repeat, Making and Unmaking of Carolingians, 751 to 888. So please check out for it. I will absolutely read it myself. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.